When Jess Parker took a gamble on 4 abandoned shipping containers, she had no idea she was about to unlock a secret buried beneath layers of rust and time. What began as a way to make some quick cash soon spiraled into a journey that would challenge her skill, her heart, and her future. But as she pried open the first container and caught a glimpse of what lay inside, she realized the price of these treasures wasn't just money. It was something far more valuable. Before we dive in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're a fan of stories about second chances, hidden treasures, and the power of restoring what's broken, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode holds a reveal that will leave you breathless. Let's get started. Jess Parker didn't expect much from the 4 rusted containers she'd bought at the online auction. They seemed like a fleeting impulse, another cheap project to fill her time, a mechanic's way to make some quick cash. The auction had been too good to be true. 4 metal boxes abandoned on an old lot, marked with a starting bid that was well within her reach. She'd always loved a challenge, but this one was different. She wasn't a treasure hunter, but Jess had been fixing cars for years. She knew what was worth salvaging, and she had a knack for seeing potential in things most people overlooked. The containers had been sold with vague descriptions and a few blurry photos, showing nothing more than a collection of rusted, dented metal. No one else had bid. Jess had the edge, both financially and mentally. But now, standing in front of the first container with the key in her hand, she wasn't so sure. Her fingers gripped the cold, rusted handle as she glanced around the small yard behind her garage. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dirt and gravel. It was quiet here, peaceful. Just the sound of the wind sifting through the tall grass. She turned the key, hearing the lock click, and pulled the door open. The familiar scent of old metal and decay washed over her as the creaking door swung wide. At first, she saw only darkness. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stepped back, letting the door swing open fully. When the light from the setting sun finally hit the contents of the container, Jess's breath caught. The silhouette of something large and sleek stood at the back of the container, draped in a sheet of dust and debris. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just some old junk. It was a car, and not just any car. The faded shape of a muscle car emerged from the shadows. A 1967 Shelby GT 500, sitting beneath the dirt and grime like a relic from another time. Jess had heard of the Shelby, of course, but to see it in person was something else. She stepped forward, wiping her hand across her forehead, feeling the cool sweat of anticipation. The car had clearly been forgotten, tucked away in a corner of some backlot, sealed off for years. Her mind raced. Could this really be what it looked like? A Shelby, left to rot away in a container like so many old, forgotten dreams. She'd seen plenty of beat-up vehicles in her career, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just a project. It was a piece of history, and it was hers now. A smile tugged at the corner of Jess's lips as she stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. She reached out, brushing her hand lightly across the hood, feeling the cold metal beneath the grime. The sensation was electric, like a spark had traveled from the car into her fingertips. This wasn't just another fix-up job. This was a chance to do something extraordinary. Jess stood there for a long moment, just staring at the car. The wind had picked up, the sky had darkened, and the temperature had dropped, but she didn't notice. It was like the whole world had fallen away. This was it. This was her gamble, and she had no idea what it would cost her. But one thing was certain. Jess Parker wasn't about to walk away from it now. Not when she had just uncovered the first piece of something so much bigger. Jess leaned over the car, carefully assessing the damage. The Shelby GT 500 had the bones of a masterpiece, but it was buried under years of neglect. As she moved around the vehicle, she could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. The faded, chipped paint, the cracked windshield, the rust that had eaten away at the edges of the metal, all signs of a life once lived, but now abandoned. She didn't mind the work. Jess had grown up in the garage, surrounded by tools, grease, and the smell of oil. Fixing things was in her blood. But this wasn't just a rusty shell. This was a classic, a symbol of something bigger. She knelt beside the car and ran her fingers over the weathered leather of the seats. The cracks in the upholstery seemed to tell a story, just like the peeling paint and faded chrome. Jesus, Jess muttered under her breath, pulling at a loose wire. This thing's a wreck. But beneath the damage, there was something else, something alive. Jess knew the signs. She had seen them in countless other projects. The engine had been untouched for years, but it was still there, waiting. It wasn't dead, it was just sleeping, and she could bring it back to life. As she pulled off the cover of the engine, a cloud of dust filled the air, and Jess coughed. She wiped her brow, squinting against the sunlight as it reflected off the cracked hood. But then her eyes landed on something unexpected, an engraving near the engine block, faint but visible. It was a name. Caleb. Caleb. The name seemed to linger in the air, as if it had weight. Jess paused, her fingers still gripping the cold metal of the hood. Who was Caleb, and why had his name been etched so carefully into the engine of this car? For a moment, Jess was caught off guard, her thoughts racing. She had no idea who Caleb was, but the connection was undeniable. Someone had put time, care, and love into this car, and now it was her responsibility to uncover the rest of the story. But she wasn't sure she was ready for what might come next. Jess stepped back and wiped her hands on her jeans, looking around the lot. The wind had died down, and the quiet settled over her like a blanket. It was just her and the car now. She knew there was more to this than just another restoration project. There was a legacy here, and she could feel it in her bones. With a deep breath, Jess returned her attention to the Shelby. There was work to be done, plenty of it. But this wasn't just about restoring a car anymore. This was about something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. And she couldn't walk away from it, not now. Not when she had just scratched the surface. Pulling open the toolbox in the corner, Jess grabbed a wrench and turned back to the car. She was ready to get to work, but this time, it felt different. As her hands moved over the engine, she could almost hear a whisper of something long gone. The sound of a man and his son laughing in the garage, working together to rebuild something broken. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was the weight of the name Caleb that echoed through her mind. But whatever it was, Jess was certain of one thing. This was no ordinary project. And somehow, she knew that the rest of the containers would reveal even more than she expected. The next morning, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling her back to the containers. It had been a long night of working on the Shelby, and though the car was still far from complete, Jess felt a strange sense of attachment to it. But the more she thought about the engraving Caleb, the more curious she became about the other containers. If one of them held a car with such a personal history, what would she find in the others? By midday, the sun was beating down, and Jess was already wiping sweat from her brow as she approached the second container. This one was smaller than the first, but she could already make out the outline of a vehicle through the grime and rust on the door. Unlike the first, this one had clearly been opened before. The padlock was missing, and the door looked slightly ajar, as if someone had pried it open long ago and never bothered to close it. She pulled the door wide and, just like the first, a thick layer of dust and debris greeted her. But this time, there was a different scent oil, gasoline, and something that smelled faintly like leather. As the light filtered through the cracks in the container, Jess's heart skipped a beat. A Porsche 911. Not just any Porsche, but a vintage one, its curves still smooth despite years of neglect. Jess ran her hand along the edge of the fender, feeling the warmth of the metal beneath her fingertips. There was something almost sacred about it. The body was intact, save for the wear and tear of time. The interior had a rich, worn quality. The leather seats cracked but still somehow inviting. Jess pulled herself inside the container to get a closer look. There was a small faded sticker on the dashboard, barely legible now. She crouched down and rubbed the dust away, revealing the logo of a racing company. The name Luca Racing was etched beneath it. Her fingers brushed against the faded leather of the steering wheel, and her thoughts drifted. Who had owned this car? What kind of life had it lived before it ended up here, hidden away like the Shelby? A clink of metal against metal caught her attention, and Jess froze. Underneath the seat, there was something hidden. She knelt down and slowly reached under the dusty fabric, pulling out a small, weathered envelope. The paper was delicate, almost fragile, and as she carefully opened it, a yellowed photograph fell into her lap. It was a picture of a man standing proudly next to the Porsche, his arm draped over the hood. He was smiling, his face young and full of life. And there, in the background, was the unmistakable logo of a racetrack. Jess stared at the photo for a long time, wondering if this was the man who had once owned the car. But there was something more: the date on the back of the photo. 1982. Jess flipped the envelope over. Another name was written in faded ink. Luca Viteri. Luca. Caleb. The names echoed in her mind, bouncing off each other like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. The photograph, the car, the names, they all felt connected somehow, as if the universe had pushed them together for a reason. But the story was still hidden, and Jess was determined to uncover it. She tucked the photograph carefully back into the envelope and placed it in her bag. There was more work to be done, but Jess couldn't stop thinking about the names, the connections, the history buried inside these vehicles. These weren't just cars to be restored. They were pieces of a story, and Jess had only just begun to dig. As she stood up, a deep sense of responsibility washed over her. She wasn't just working on machines. She was piecing together the lives of people who had long since disappeared. These cars, these treasures, held more than just value. They held memories, legacies, and perhaps even secrets that were meant to stay buried. But now that Jess had uncovered them, she couldn't just walk away. The story was unfolding, one container at a time, and Jess had no intention of leaving it unfinished. The days began to blur together for Jess as she worked tirelessly on the cars. But no matter how much progress she made, something nagged at her. It wasn't the repairs she knew how to fix cars. It wasn't the rust or the grime she had spent years elbow-deep in worse. No, it was the lingering question of who had left these vehicles behind and why they were hidden in the first place. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these cars than just a fortune in parts and labor. It was on one of those long, solitary evenings that Jackson showed up. Jess had heard his name in passing. He was a local legend when it came to classic car restoration, a man whose reputation could have been built in any major city. But instead, he'd stuck around, quietly fixing up cars for the few who could afford him. Jess had always worked alone, but something about the way he carried himself piqued her curiosity. He walked into her shop with a toolbox slung over his shoulder, wearing a faded leather jacket and a grin that seemed to say, "I know what I'm doing." Jess didn't immediately offer a hand. She was too busy wiping down the Mustang, feeling the heat of the engine that had just been fired up for the first time in years. The sound of the engine's growl filled the garage, a satisfying hum, but Jess felt a flicker of something else. It wasn't the car she was focused on, it was Jackson, standing in the doorway, watching her. "You're the mechanic who bought the containers, huh?" he asked, leaning against the frame of the door. Jess straightened up, wiping her hands on a rag. "Guess that's me," she said, her voice guarded. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "I saw the Mustang in town the other day. Heard you were working on it." Jess nodded but didn't say anything. She didn't know him, and she didn't like the idea of people popping in uninvited. She'd always been a bit of a lone wolf, but the way Jackson spoke like he knew more about her work than she did made her uneasy. "Can I take a look?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the engine she had just gotten running. Against her better judgment, Jess stepped aside. Jackson was good, there was no denying that. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades under the hoods of the most iconic cars. His hands were steady as he ran them over the engine, inspecting the wiring and pulling out a tool to make adjustments. Jess didn't interrupt, she just watched him work, her arms crossed as she leaned against the workbench. "So, you're the one who bought the other three too?" he asked, still focused on the engine. Yeah, Jess replied, her tone clipped. And I'm working on all of them. Jackson paused and looked up from the engine. You don't know what you've got yourself into, he said quietly. Jess's heart skipped a beat. She didn't like being underestimated, especially by someone who didn't know her. What's that supposed to mean? You've got cars in those containers worth more than your entire shop's worth, Jackson said, his voice calm but insistent. These aren't just cars. They're pieces of history, each one with a story tied to them. I've worked on my fair share of classics, but these aren't just projects. They're legacies. Jess felt a rush of emotion she couldn't quite name. She'd known there was something special about them, but Jackson's words made it feel real. He was right. These cars weren't just about fixing up the engine and making a sale. They were more than that. She watched as he began working on the Shelby, adjusting the carburetor with the precision of someone who had spent years learning the nuances of every bolt and part. Jess couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He was good, too good. She'd never admit it, but she could use his expertise. What do you know about the history of these cars? Jess asked, her voice softer now. Jackson glanced up at her. I know a lot of things, he said, but I'm guessing you don't want to hear the whole story just yet. Try me, Jess replied, her curiosity piqued. Jackson sighed and sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. These cars belonged to a family with a dark past. Some people say they were part of a racing dynasty. Others say they were involved in something much bigger. The man who owned them was involved in illegal races, back when it wasn't just about speed but who could get away with the most. I'm talking underground stuff. The kind of people who didn't want their names in the papers. Jess swallowed. She had a feeling this wasn't going to be an easy story to hear. And you think these cars are connected to all that? I know they are, Jackson said, his voice low. The markings on the cars, the personal items left behind, those aren't just coincidences. Someone doesn't just abandon a 1967 Shelby GT 500. They do it when they have something to hide. Jess felt a chill run down her spine. She had always been a mechanic. Fixing things was what she knew. But now, with Jackson's words sinking in, it felt like she was standing at the edge of something much darker, something bigger than she could fix with a wrench. Maybe we should get started, Jess said, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But inside, she couldn't stop thinking about what Jackson had said. These cars weren't just about making money or restoring a classic. They were about legacy, secrets, and history she wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. Jess couldn't shake the feeling that the story behind these cars was growing larger than she could handle. Jackson had dropped a bombshell about the racing dynasty and underground dealings, but as the days wore on, she couldn't find a way to move past the nagging questions. What if everything she was uncovering, every old photograph, every forgotten key, was part of a much bigger picture than just some abandoned cars? After a long day of working under the hood of the Shelby, Jess sat on the edge of the workbench, staring at the manila envelope Jackson had unearthed from the Porsche's seat. The faded letter inside the envelope had caught her eye again. She hadn't opened it yet. Something told her she wasn't ready for what it might reveal. But as the hours stretched into the quiet of the night, Jess found herself unable to resist any longer. The paper was delicate, yellowed with age, but still intact. She gently unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words written in neat, careful handwriting. To whoever comes after me, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm gone. I wanted to share a piece of my story with you, one that's been buried for too long. These cars, my cars, are more than just machines. They're pieces of my heart, my history, my family. I hope you'll understand. My father, Luca Viteri, built these cars not just to race but to remember. He lost so much along the way, more than I ever knew, and these cars were his way of holding on to what he couldn't let go. But the past, for all its beauty and triumphs, is also heavy with pain. These vehicles are the final link I have to a father who was never quite the same after the war. The tracks he raced on weren't always just about speed. They were about survival. My hope is that, if you find these cars, you'll give them what they deserve. restore them, but also remember that they carry stories with them. Stories of love, loss, and dreams that never died. I trust you'll know what to do with them. Luca Viteri, Jr. Jess sat back, the letter resting in her lap. The weight of it settled over her like a shroud, and for a moment, she wasn't sure what to do next. The letter had confirmed what Jackson had alluded to. These weren't just cars. They were pieces of a family's legacy, a history tangled up in love, sacrifice, and the ghosts of the past. The name Luca Viteri echoed in her mind, bringing the pieces of the puzzle together. Jackson had mentioned the Viteri family before, how their name was tied to underground races, but this letter painted a deeper picture. These cars were a way for Luca Viteri Jr. to remember his father, who had been irrevocably changed by the war. Jess's mind raced. What happened to Luca? What happened to this family? She reached for the stack of photographs she had found inside the Porsche. The old Polaroids were filled with faded faces Luca Jr. in his youth, standing proudly next to the cars, a confident smile on his face. His father, Luca Sr., stood beside him, the weight of something unsaid in his eyes. The photos spoke of a time before everything had gone wrong, before the cars had been hidden away in these rusted containers. The more Jess stared at the photographs, the more she understood that this story was about far more than just restoring old cars. It was about uncovering a piece of history, a family torn apart by the consequences of their actions and choices, a history that had been buried for decades. These cars were the only remaining connection to a past that had been locked away. As the night deepened, Jess felt an unfamiliar sense of responsibility settle over her. She wasn't just fixing up the vehicles anymore. She was honoring a legacy, bringing it back to life piece by piece. But this task wasn't just about mechanical skill. It was about understanding the depth of what these cars represented. Each scratch, each dent, each faded emblem carried memories Jess wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. She tucked the letter back into the envelope, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what it meant. She couldn't undo the past, but she could give these cars a new future. She could make them matter again. The decision to continue was no longer a choice, it was a responsibility. Jess Parker wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a keeper of history. And the legacy of Luca Viteri wasn't something she could walk away from. The sun had barely risen, casting an orange glow across the workshop when Jess arrived the next morning. Her mind was still racing, replaying the letter from Luca Viteri Jr. over and over. She had barely slept, the weight of the words heavy on her chest. These weren't just old cars. They were more than that. They were a part of a broken family's history, a family that had suffered, sacrificed, and lived in the shadows of something they'd never fully understood. Jess was about to dive deeper into that history, and she didn't know if she was prepared for what it might reveal. As she stood in the shop, looking at the 4 containers, she felt an unexpected sense of unease. The garage felt emptier than usual, even though the steady hum of her tools and the soft rhythm of the clock on the wall should have made it feel normal. But something had shifted. The light streaming through the windows didn't seem as warm. The air smelled different, cooler, almost heavy. That's when she heard a sound, faint at first, coming from the back lot. A car engine. It was low, throaty, and distant, but it made Jess's heart race in an instant. She rushed to the window and peered outside. Her pulse quickened when she saw the sleek black sedan parked just outside the yard. A man sat in the driver's seat, the windows tinted enough to hide his face. Jess felt a chill crawl up her spine. The car was unfamiliar, its edges too sharp, its look too calculated. Whoever this was, they weren't here by accident. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding. Her fingers grazed the edge of the workbench as she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She had a sinking feeling that the discovery of these cars wasn't going to be as simple as fixing engines and restoring parts. There was something more at play. Something dangerous. The man in the black sedan didn't seem to be in a hurry. He stayed there for a while, the engine idling, the faint rumble vibrating through the walls of the shop. Jess wasn't sure how long he'd been there, but it felt like hours. It was only when the car finally pulled away, driving down the gravel road, that Jess allowed herself to breathe again. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. Jess's mind raced as she returned to the workbench, trying to focus on the car in front of her. But the weight of the man's presence lingered. She had always worked alone, always handled things on her own. But now, with the cars and the strange man lurking outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that her every move was being observed. She needed answers. That's when Jackson showed up, as if on cue. His truck rumbled into the lot, and Jess watched him pull up from the window. He wasn't the type to show up unannounced, and Jess could feel the tension in her chest loosen just a little when she saw him step out of the truck, looking every bit the part of someone who had seen too much of the world. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, walking toward her shop with a knowing look on his face. Jess didn't hesitate. "Someone was out there, in a black sedan, just watching me." Jackson didn't flinch. "People do that around here, but not usually for good reasons." Jess stared at him. "What do you mean?" Jackson's expression darkened. "There's a lot more to these cars than you think, Jess, and there's a reason they were hidden away. A reason no one wants them brought back to life." Jess's stomach churned. "Who would want to stop me from restoring them? They're just cars." "Not just cars," Jackson replied, his voice low. "These vehicles are worth more than money. Whoever hid them didn't do it for nothing. They were trying to keep something buried. And I think you're about to find out what." Jess's heart sank as Jackson's words settled in. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected to feel like she was up against something bigger than just rust and metal. There was a power at play here, something that didn't want these cars to see the light of day again. She wasn't sure who was behind it or why, but Jess was certain of one thing. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when she was this close to unraveling the truth. But she couldn't shake the feeling that every turn she made would take her deeper into a dangerous world she wasn't prepared for. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the quiet garage as Jess moved toward the workbench. Jackson's words were still lingering in the back of her mind. "These vehicles are worth more than money. Whoever hid them didn't do it for nothing." The feeling of being watched, of being caught up in something bigger than she could understand, was getting stronger. And yet, despite the unease that clung to her, Jess couldn't back down. She'd started this journey to restore these cars, and she wasn't about to stop now. But as she stood in front of the workbench, staring down at the manila envelope from the Porsche, Jess felt a deep sense of inevitability settle over her. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, she reached for the envelope again. She hadn't looked at the final contents yet, the thing she had been avoiding. The photograph of Luca Viteri Jr. had been haunting her, and now it was time to look deeper into the past. The letter had given her a glimpse into the world of the Viteri family, but there was more. She could feel it in her bones. The more she looked, the more she uncovered, the more she realized that Luca Viteri Jr.'s life, his history, and the cars themselves were entwined in something darker than she'd imagined. Opening the envelope carefully, Jess pulled out a small, old photograph. The edges were curled, the colors faded with time, but the image was clear. A group of men stood around a car, a vintage Ferrari, polished and gleaming under the harsh lights of what appeared to be a racetrack. The men were dressed in sharp, expensive suits, their faces stern, as if they knew the world was watching them. At the center of the group stood Luca Viteri Jr., a younger version of the man in the Polaroids, his eyes hard, his jaw set. Jess studied the photograph, her fingers brushing over the faded ink that was written on the back in the same neat handwriting as the letter. Luca Viteri Senior Racing Syndicate, 1969. Jess's heart skipped a beat. Racing syndicate? This was no casual hobby. The Viteri family hadn't just been a part of the racing world, they had been at the center of it, involved in something much bigger and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She flipped the photograph over and found something even more troubling. A name, barely legible. The Phoenix Group. Jess's mind raced. What was the Phoenix Group? A part of the racing world? Or something darker? Her pulse quickened as the weight of the words sank in. The Phoenix Group, it had to be connected to the underground world Jackson had mentioned, but the question remained. What role had the Viteri family played in all of this? Why had they hidden these cars away? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Jackson's truck pulling up again. This time, Jess didn't wait for him to walk in. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The door swung open, and Jackson stepped inside, a little more serious than usual. Jess didn't hesitate. "Jackson, I need you to tell me everything you know. About the Phoenix Group, about the Viteri family. I'm not leaving here until you do." Jackson paused at the door, his eyes scanning her face. It was rare for Jess to show this kind of urgency, and it wasn't lost on him. He knew the truth was heavy, and the more Jess pushed, the more the truth would weigh on her. But he could see it in her eyes. She needed to know. He sighed and sat down on the workbench, leaning back against the wall. "All right. You're right. It's time you knew what you're really dealing with." He leaned forward, running a hand through his hair as he began to speak. The Phoenix Group wasn't just some racing syndicate. It was a network of wealthy individuals who ran illegal races across the country, high stakes, no rules. They had everything: money, power, connections. But what people didn't know was that the races weren't just about speed. They were a way for them to launder money, cover up shady deals, and settle scores. Your Viteri family, Luca Sr., Luca Jr., and the others, they were at the heart of it all. Jess listened intently, her eyes narrowing as Jackson spoke. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Luca Viteri Jr. was more than just a racer. He was a leader in the group. His father, Luca Sr., had founded the syndicate, and his son carried on the legacy. But it wasn't just about racing cars. It was about controlling the underground world of wealth and influence. They used these cars, classic, valuable vehicles, as collateral in these races. If you won, you kept the car. If you lost everything. The Viteris were ruthless, and they were involved in some dangerous deals. When things started to fall apart for them, they hid the cars, these four in particular, so no one could find them. Jess swallowed hard. So, they didn't just disappear because they wanted to leave a legacy. They hid them because they were running from something. "Exactly," Jackson confirmed. "And now you're uncovering all of it. That's why I was worried when I saw you working on them. Someone doesn't want these cars to be restored, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure they stay buried." Jess's heart raced as the full weight of the situation hit her. She wasn't just restoring cars. She was pulling at the thread of a web that had been carefully woven to hide a dark, dangerous past. But as the reality of the situation set in, Jess knew there was no turning back. She wasn't going to stop now. Not when she was so close. She would finish what she started, even if it meant facing whatever or whoever was standing in her way. The quiet that had settled over the shop now felt heavier, more oppressive. The weight of Jackson's words lingered like a storm cloud hanging above Jess's head. Someone doesn't want these cars to be restored. The thought gnawed at her. She hadn't just bought rusted, abandoned vehicles, she had unknowingly dug up a legacy tied to an underground criminal syndicate. A legacy that some people would do anything to protect. But the more Jess thought about it, the more she realized that backing down wasn't an option. These cars weren't just machines, they were symbols of a broken past, of people who had lost everything. They had stories to tell, and Jess wasn't going to let anyone silence them. The next few days passed in a blur of long hours, greasy hands, and the steady hum of her tools. Jess had decided to work through it, to focus on the restoration, to bury the fear and uncertainty that had started to creep in. The cars didn't care about her doubts. They didn't care about the danger. They just needed someone to bring them back to life. But the creeping tension outside the shop was impossible to ignore. She'd seen the black sedan again, parked on the outskirts of her yard, watching her every move. She'd heard the whispers of the neighbors, the ones who had lived here long enough to know when something was wrong, when a storm was brewing. And now, it was all coming to a head. It was early evening when Jess was finishing up on the Shelby. She had just wiped the last layer of grease off the hood when a car pulled up to the shop, its headlights cutting through the fading light of the day. She recognized the vehicle instantly. A sleek black SUV, the same one that had appeared the day she first noticed the man watching her. The door opened, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out, his face familiar. It was the same man from the sedan. His eyes were cold, calculating, and he walked toward the shop with the kind of purpose that sent a chill through Jess. She didn't wait for him to knock. She wasn't going to play the waiting game anymore. The stakes were too high. The man stopped just outside the door, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "Jess Parker," he said, his voice smooth, almost too polite. "I'm glad to see you're making progress." Jess stood her ground, her heart pounding. "What do you want?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've uncovered something. Something that's been buried for a long time. I'm here to make sure it stays buried." Jess didn't flinch, but she felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean? You've been restoring the cars, but you don't understand what you're really dealing with," the man said, his tone turning darker. "You've crossed a line, and now I need you to step back. Leave these cars alone, take the money, and walk away." Jess's jaw tightened. She had expected this threats, intimidation, but hearing it from this man made it feel real. This wasn't just about the cars. This was about power, control, and a history that someone wanted to stay hidden. "I'm not walking away," Jess said firmly, her voice unwavering. "These cars belong to the past, and they deserve to be seen. I'm not going to just leave them rotting in the ground." "Oh," the man's smile faltered for a moment, and Jess could see the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Jess. You think you're in control, but you're not. You don't know who you're dealing with. The Viteri family isn't something you want to mess with." Jess didn't back down. "And I'm not scared of you," the man chuckled, but it was a cold, hollow sound. "You should be. This is bigger than you think. You've opened a door, and now you have to deal with what comes through it. I'm giving you a choice. Walk away, take the money, and forget everything you've learned about these cars, or we'll make sure you never finish what you started." Jess's mind raced, but she didn't hesitate. "If I walk away, I'll never forgive myself." The man's expression hardened, and for a moment, Jess thought he might snap. But then he simply nodded, his eyes cold. "You'll regret this, Jess, but it's your choice." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, disappearing into the night. Jess stood frozen for a moment, her mind whirling. She had just been offered a way out. A chance to take the money, walk away, and never look back. But she knew that wasn't who she was. The cars, the story, they mattered too much. As the sound of the SUV faded into the distance, Jess took a deep breath and looked at the Shelby in front of her. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when she was so close. She wasn't afraid of the threats. She wasn't afraid of the danger. This was bigger than money. This was about something that couldn't be bought or sold. It was about history, legacy, and the truth. Jess had no intention of letting anyone, no matter how powerful, stand in her way. The next few days were a blur of adrenaline and sleepless nights. Jess didn't back down after the threat. She couldn't. The words the man had said still echoed in her mind, but they only fueled her determination. She wasn't just fixing cars anymore. She was restoring history. And this history, this legacy, was hers to uncover. The Shelby was close to being finished, and Jess could feel a strange connection to it. As her hands ran over the smooth, newly polished surface, she couldn't help but think of the family it had belonged to. Luca Viteri Sr. had built it to race, to win. But it had become so much more than that. It was a piece of someone's life, someone's love, and it had been hidden away for decades. The thought that she was the one who was going to bring it back to life was humbling, and it was becoming clear that it wasn't just about the car. It was about something bigger, a story of loss, love, and legacy. As she stepped back to admire the car, her mind wandered. She thought about the Viteri family, Luca Sr. and Luca Jr., and the price they had paid for their involvement in the underground racing world. Their world wasn't just about engines and speed. It was about power, control, and the cost of making the wrong choices. Jess had learned that the hard way, and now she was paying the price. The black sedan, the threats, the feeling of being watched, it was all part of the same story. A story that was far from over. She was working alone that night, as she often did, the steady hum of her tools, the only sound in the shop. The air smelled like oil and metal, and the dim light cast long shadows across the garage. The Shelby was almost finished, its engine purring like it had just been awakened from a long slumber. The work was far from easy, but Jess felt a deep sense of satisfaction with every turn of the wrench, every polished surface, every restored detail. But as she tightened the final bolt on the engine, Jess realized something that made her pause. This wasn't just about restoring the car, it was about restoring herself. In the quiet of the garage, Jess found herself thinking back to when she first started. She had been just a girl, working in her father's shop, surrounded by broken-down cars and the hum of engines. She had never imagined that one day she would be fixing something like the Shelby, something with so much history, so much weight. But somewhere along the way, as the years passed and the repairs piled up, Jess had started to doubt herself. She had started to think that she wasn't capable of doing anything more than getting by, that she would always be the girl behind the counter, fixing other people's broken things. But the work she was doing now, the restoration of these cars, the uncovering of a story buried for decades, was changing her. It wasn't just about the mechanics anymore. It was about the people, the legacies, and the second chances that these cars represented. She was learning to fix herself, one turn of the wrench at a time. Jess took a step back and wiped the sweat from her brow, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The Shelby was nearly complete, but it wasn't just the car that was being restored. It was her. She thought about the day she had bought the containers, her initial excitement, the feeling of taking a chance. Back then, she had been searching for something beyond the endless repairs and the monotonous days spent alone in the shop. She hadn't known it at the time, but what she was really searching for was purpose, a reason to believe in something greater than herself. And now, with the Shelby almost ready, Jess realized that purpose had found her. It wasn't about the money or the recognition, it was about the work, the stories, the connections, and maybe, just maybe, it was about giving herself the second chance she had been searching for all along. As she looked at the completed car, Jess smiled. She had done it. She had restored the Shelby, but more importantly, she had restored her own sense of purpose. The legacy of the Viteri family, with all its darkness and light, was now a part of her story, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The night was still, the only sound the soft hum of the lights overhead. Jess took a deep breath, knowing that she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't just a mechanic in a small town, fixing broken cars. She was part of something bigger now, a legacy that was as much hers as it was anyone else's. The garage was still. The cars, now fully restored, gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The Shelby GT 500, the Porsche 911, the Ferrari 275 GTB, and the rare classic Porsche, all four vehicles sat in a row, each one restored to its former glory, each one holding a piece of the past. Jess had done the impossible. She had breathed life back into them, bringing their stories out of the shadows. But as she stood in front of them, staring at the gleaming chrome and polished surfaces, Jess knew that this was more than just a victory. The real challenge was what came next. The cars were ready for the world, but so was she. And there was no telling what that would bring. The black SUV had shown up again that morning, parked just outside the shop. The same man who had threatened her weeks earlier had arrived with an offer she could no longer ignore. He wanted to buy the cars. All of them. He didn't care about the history. He didn't care about the stories. He just wanted them gone. But this time, the offer felt different. The weight of his words had shifted from cold calculation to something darker. Jess had refused his first offer, and the man had given her a choice. Walk away, take the money, and leave the past where it belonged. She'd stood firm, refusing to sell the cars. But now, as she stood in the shop, staring at the polished surfaces of the restored vehicles, Jess couldn't help but wonder, was this her final choice? Was this the moment when she would have to decide whether the past, this legacy, was worth risking everything for? A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Jackson. He had been there through every twist and turn, his quiet support the only thing that had kept her grounded. Jess walked over to the door, opening it to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You finished?" he asked quietly. Jess nodded. "Yeah, they're ready." Jackson stepped inside, his gaze shifting from car to car, taking in the sight of the restored vehicles. He had seen them in their original, rusted state, but now they looked like something out of a dream. "They're beautiful," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. "You did good, Jess." "I didn't just restore cars," she replied, her voice steady. "I restored their stories, their legacies." Jackson looked at her, a flicker of something in his eyes. "And what about your story?" Jess turned, her gaze drifting back to the cars. "I don't know. I guess I'm still figuring that out." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. Jess had come so far. She had uncovered a family's secrets, restored their memories, and in the process, she had discovered something about herself. But now, standing in front of the cars, she realized that the choice she faced was no longer about restoring metal. It was about what she was going to do with what she had learned. Just as she was about to speak, the door swung open again. The same man from the SUV stepped inside, his cold eyes fixed on Jess. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, his voice smooth but insistent. "The cars. You sell them to me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything ever again. Take the money, and walk away from all of this. We'll make sure the past stays buried." Jess looked at him, the weight of his offer heavy in the air. The temptation was there, the easy out, the money, the freedom. But Jess knew better than to take the easy way out. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about anything that could be bought. "I'm not selling," Jess said firmly, her voice unwavering. "Not now. Not ever." The man's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Jess saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. But then he turned and walked away without another word, the door slamming shut behind him. Jess let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The decision had been made. Jackson looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" Jess nodded, a sense of finality settling over her. "Yeah, I'm sure." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Word spread quickly about the restored cars, and soon, offers started pouring in, some legitimate, some not so legitimate. But Jess stood firm. She refused to let the legacy of the Viteri family be reduced to a business deal. These cars weren't just vehicles. They were pieces of history, pieces of a life that had been lost. But now they were going to have their moment in the Sunday. Jess wasn't going to let anyone take that away. And in the end, she found something she hadn't expected. A sense of peace. The cars had been restored, but more importantly, Jess had restored herself. She wasn't just the mechanic who fixed broken things. She was the keeper of legacies, the one who brought stories back to life. Jess stood in the shop, the light from the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. She looked at the cars one last time, her heart full. There was no turning back now. She had made the right choice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.